Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is brought to you by Carium, the telehealth platform enabling healthcare's digital transformation, helping you care for people within the fabric of their daily lives. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Bronwyn Spira, CEO and co-founder at Force Therapeutics. Bronwyn, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt.
So what I always like to do before getting into the main part of the discussion is to give my guests a chance to provide more of an introduction in terms of who they are and what they do. So Bronwyn, the floor is yours.
Super, thanks so much. So as you mentioned, I'm Bronwyn Spira, founder and CEO of Force Therapeutics. Prior to starting Force, I was a clinician for a long time, over 20 years. I don't think about that as my past life, but, I'd been treating patients for a long time in multiple different settings and across the board, just kind of really coming to understand deeply the challenges that my patients had with recovery after injury or surgery. And many of the issues were related to access to the right providers and the right health information that I knew would empower them to manage their care. And so some of those barriers were physical or educational, language, psychosocial, economic. But the point being that all of these barriers really had an impact on the patient's outcomes. Functional outcomes, quality of life. And I just saw an opportunity to help solve them, just given the ubiquity of smartphones and access to technology. And patients were banking online and booking travel online. And I just thought that there was a really good opportunity to use technology in a positive way to impact health outcomes.
And so I guess before diving into specifically what opportunity you saw and how you're building on that, I'm just kind of curious, what first got you into healthcare?
That's a great question. I was a dancer growing up. I did ballet when I was younger, and so was very kind of not only engaged and curious about the biomechanics of the body, but also aware and around people who were suffering with a lot of musculoskeletal injuries, and felt that I wanted a deeper understanding. I wanted to know how they happened, how to solve them, how to fix them. And so I started my, education in science and physical therapy.
That's a very different approach into it. And as you just said, kind of taking physical therapy, and I'm assuming that has now kind of informed, the work that you're doing and, the direction that you've ended up going in.
Very much so. I think, musculoskeletal issues impact 60% of the population. I don't think anybody in your audience or you doesn't know somebody who cannot do their sport or their work or live their life the way they want to as a result of some kind of back pain, knee pain, shoulder pain. And it's really very wide-reaching, and it has an impact on all aspects of life. And so when you have a musculoskeletal injury, it leads to other comorbidities like diabetes and high BMI and things that then have a kind of a ripple effect on health. But so many of them really, really start with that kind of musculoskeletal issue. And so getting to the root cause of the problem, I think, can have a big impact on patients' lives.
So how has kind of the growth and expanding use of technology helped get to that root cause of the issues that you were just mentioning?
So I think, back to my original point around access, so patients have a lot of issues with access. So either they can't get to the right provider, or in the case of physical therapy, it's often recommended they come 2 or 3 times a week. They have to leave their job. They have to find transportation, leave childcare. So it becomes very complicated and difficult, not to mention the high copays. And so what I found was that my patients just wouldn't come and then they wouldn't get better. And I know as their provider, as somebody who is trained in the medical profession, what is ailing them and what they need to do to get better. And because they couldn't access me, they couldn't access that information. And so the concept behind Force Therapeutics was if a patient could access the right information from a trusted source that knew their specific condition, they would be able to improve their outcomes. And I think there's a really important point in there, which is, we always think about provider-driven care. It shouldn't be just generic care out of a box or Dr. Google or YouTube videos that they've kind of searched online. It really needs to be specific to the patient. And so their care team, their provider, their surgeon, their physical therapist, their physiatrist, their treating care team is really the best source of that information.
So kind of, as you said, with the care team being the best source of the information, what are effective means that you've seen of being able to convey that information and also kind of, I think it's not even just implicitly, but explicitly increase access through the use of technology?
So a couple things. I mean, for what we use for our patients is really very easy to understand video-based education. So instead of what patients used to get, let's say they were going to get a joint replaced, let's say a knee replacement, they'd go into their doctor's office, they'd get a huge packet of information that was 1,000 pages long, and they'd have to go home and read all of that, understand all the medicalese in there, and then kind of understand what that meant for them. And what we've developed is these bite-sized videos that are targeted to any education level, easy to understand with visuals and voiceovers in multiple languages that are really designed to help patients understand exactly what they need to do and when they need to do it. I mean, I think that's the other piece of it, right, is you can only absorb so much information at one time. And so we think about the right information in the right format delivered to that patient at the right time. So our patients typically get a protocolized video plan, but they'll only get each segment when it's relevant to them. Preoperatively, you're not going to get information about running a marathon, but 6 months out, you may need that information. So that's really where we think about how adults learn. So we have a learning specialist who helps develop our content, and then what's the best format, how do we language it, how is it perceived, and, even for our classes, we do a teach back so that not only do we educate the patients, but we then make sure that they actually understood what it was that we were expecting of them.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. So kind of how does that teach back process operate?
So we have a pretty sophisticated learning and development program within the Force platform that patients receive. And based upon the provider's prescription, they get delivered a bite-sized information video. And let's say you're about to have knee surgery, going back to our prior example, you may need to know exactly how to manage the incision because your knee's going to be cut open and you're going to get home and you're going to have this big old wound there. And so you might need to know what to do to prepare for that. So we will educate you on that and then ask you, well, what did you learn? How would you, manage the dressing, and those kind of things. So we really try to make sure not only that we're delivering the right information, but that it's been ingested and, internalized by the patient so that they are best able to take care of themselves.
Yeah, and that sounds like it's a step that would be missing in a lot of different scenarios, whether you're talking about remote engagement or even in-person engagement, because it's, kind of as you're talking about it, it's one thing to be able to convey the information outwards, but then to confirm that not only has it been received but actually understood that sounds like it's, arguably a gap that had been existing for a while, because I feel like I don't usually hear, that description of that, that type of engagement.
And engagement is really the key here. And I think it's such an overused word in healthcare, but traditionally, health systems would have patients come in and sit through 2 or 3 hours of what they called a joint class before they had a surgery or a spine class. And that may or may not have gone away in the organizations we work with. But the point is that, even when a patient leaves that session, they're probably retaining maybe 15%, right? So we need to be reinforcing that information and then making sure that they have a place to come back to. I think that's one of the big things about technology is that, it lives in our system and they can access it 24/7 and their care partner can access it 24/7. So maybe only they could come in, but their carer or their partner or their spouse who's taking care of them when they get home couldn't come to that class. They can actually access all of that information and be a support structure when that patient gets home. So I think, that's really the value of having a technology that supports what your provider is saying. And it's important that there's consistency there, because what you don't want to create is when your patients are hearing one thing and then reading another thing from your program. And that's why we work very, very closely with our providers to make sure that what they want the patients to know is exactly what's captured in our system.
Yeah, no, the consistency is always very important, because as you said, if you find a disconnect, that's what's going to stick out, and most likely that's what you'll end up remembering. Or even if you don't remember it, it could erode the trust and the accuracy of the information that you're receiving.
Yeah, and causes disengagement. So then the patient's confused and they're like, well, I'm throwing my hands up here. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, so I'm going to do nothing. And that's really the danger, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you said, if you get someone who becomes disengaged, then the ability to, or the likelihood of any information being retained then just keeps falling even more dramatically.
Absolutely.
So kind of thinking about the engagement, as you're providing all these resources and education and kind of feedback loops, what else have you found effective to drive the patient to do, or what other kind of means are there to increase the level of engagement?
It's a great question, and it's a difficult answer because it's not one thing, it's 1,000 things. And we, Force started in 2010. And so over the past 12 years, we study every interaction of our patients with the system. And we know exactly when they drop off and exactly when they're highly engaged. And so we actually use that information, that data, to continue to iterate on what drives patient engagement. And just some examples for you. For example, everything that is presented to the patient is with the face and the voice of the actual care team. And that is very encouraging for patients. If you know that the person who you saw in the clinic is also the person that's delivering your care instructions, that's something you should trust. I think the video-based element is very important because patients can't always absorb tons and tons of words on the page. And just being able to access this care anytime and engage others to help them is also, those are just some key elements, but there are multiple things that we continue to improve on. And, it's never done. We keep improving, we keep iterating, and that's, innovative technology. That's kind of the pressure we place on ourselves to think, but could we be better? And so that's kind of the fun part of developing health tech.
Yeah, and kind of as you said, the iterative process, should be expected because, health clearly is not static, nor is human behavior static. So, why shouldn't the tools that are interacting with individuals also evolve?
Absolutely. And I've been in healthcare for now, I think, just over 30 years. I've never seen a period where the change has been so drastic and so quick, especially healthcare traditionally is such a slow-moving behemoth, right? And I'd say during and since the pandemic, there is so much change going on in regulation, in even reimbursement and in attitudes, that I think, it's really spurring on this new digital age. And I really do think it's going to change the way we deliver healthcare and the way we spend money on healthcare.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you that there's been, you could kind of see the wave building, but then the pandemic just, kind of forced it to crash finally instead of continuing to just be held off. But for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Bronwyn Spira of Force Therapeutics and talking about engagement and provision of information and education and really driving understanding. And kind of the next piece of it that I'm wondering about is, as I said, we've been talking about that kind of engagement, but what about, the ability to collect information from patients and have patients kind of reporting on information? How has that changed, or how is the acceptance of that information kind of changed as it's become more readily available?
Yeah, I think it's really become critical because for the first time, I think providers can see exactly what is going on with their patients, and make that transparency actionable. And so whereas, I go back to my days in the clinic where we would collect everything on paper and we'd ask patients these questionnaires while they were sitting in the waiting room, and then, we'd score the forms and figure out what that meant and try and figure out what the benchmark was. Now everything can be done electronically. And so, maybe take a step back and just say, what are these forms that we use? They're called patient-reported outcome measures. And I think you've spoken about them on your podcast before, but they really are validated questionnaires that patients fill out, and that are scored according to a specific algorithm that's been validated in research. And the responses, when scored, give the providers an indication of a patient's overall level of function or their quality of life against an established benchmark. So it's very helpful because it can be, when I mentioned before that it can be actionable if you see that a patient is not progressing according to that benchmark, or they're not achieving what's called minimal clinical change, then you can intervene and you can change the outcome. But if you only find that out 6 months later, there's very little you can do about it. So, speaking again about technology, where it's helpful is these forms or these scores are now presented to providers, and they can action on those results in real time. So they can see them, they can measure them against a benchmark, and they can do something about it. So not only does that help individual patients, but it helps inform, I always think about, data-driven care. And so this really helps providers and organizations think about how to, develop their evidence-based care management protocols.
It kind of, as you just mentioned, being able to get the data more frequently than, say, every 6 months or whatever the visit frequency would have been in the past. Now that it can be collected through a technology intervention, is there a preferred cadence to that, or is there something where you could get too frequent and you're not able to capture variations?
It's a great question. So, we always look at Medicare to set the standards. So they have kind of recommended intervals where you should collect outcomes. And obviously that makes it easy to compare to a benchmark. So typically it's preoperatively, and then, 6 weeks post-op, 12 weeks post-op, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. And when you get that data collected at scale, then you can really understand how your protocols are performing and how patients are responding to your care. But you're right, it can be an overwhelming thing for patients. And what we've seen from our data is that if the patients get too many forms too often, we see a drop-off in engagement. And so, sticking with the theme of data-driven care design, we can go back to our provider organizations and make a recommendation and say, we know you want to collect all these 6 forms at week 3, but our recommendation is that you will see a disengaged patient. So we recommend 3 forms, this many questions, and not to have multiple conflicting technologies collecting that information. So you're right, there is this kind of sweet spot that we try to work within so that we don't overwhelm patients, but we get the data we need.
Yeah, and maybe actually kind of taking a step back to help level set, like what is the type of information that's collected through that validated PROM process?
So there's a couple of different kind of types of forms. For the musculoskeletal population, we use something called functional outcome forms. And so those forms might ask a patient, do you have pain going up and down stairs? Can you pivot on your affected leg? Is it difficult to get up out of a chair? Do you have pain when you're turning in bed? And so there's a list of questions, and then the patients give their responses, and then we can score where they sit on a functional scale. And then there's quality of life forms. So it's not only important to understand how the patient's functioning, it's important to understand how that function impacts their quality of life. Because if somebody just wants to sit and watch TV, they could be at a lower functional level and it doesn't change anything for them. But you have an athlete and they really want to be performing at that high functional level. So I think you always have to look at those 2 things in connection, and actually, so we always, most of our procedures, we have a quality of life measure and a functional level, measure. And then the other big thing is obviously patient satisfaction, because that ties everything together, because you have to understand, well, is this, this patient underwent surgery, are they happy with the outcome? And that's really a lot of, a lot goes into that, but it's really important to understand patient satisfaction as well.
Yeah, it seems like you're making a very key point there, which is it's not just about, the impact on the change, but, what was the individual expecting out of the outcome, or not out of the outcome, but what type of outcome were they expecting, and what were they expecting the impact of the intervention to be?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we have done a lot of research on this topic exactly, and found that if patients are engaged in understanding expectations, or we understand the expectations, there is a very strong correlation to their patient satisfaction after surgery. And so we do a lot of what's called shared decision-making, which is, do you understand that this is, what to expect when you're going through this procedure, and what are your goals? And are these goals measurable, and are they, rational? So we do a lot of work with the patients through the platform, but to really help them understand what to expect, and we help them measure that and look back and say, yes, I did achieve my goal, or it was unrealistic. So it's an important piece.
So I guess, does that mean that there was misalignment between the providers and the patients in terms of where they thought the outcome would go?
Yeah, exactly. I think what it is encouraging the patient to have that conversation, because if their expectation is, I'm going to walk out of the operating room and be able to compete in a marathon, that is not a realistic expectation. But if we know that they have that expectation, we can intervene and say, hey, listen, this is kind of the expectation. This is when you should be able to do that. And here's what patients like you have experienced with this procedure. And then the patient can say, okay, I'm not doing that then, and that's shared decision-making. So it's also helps patients be, active in their contribution to their recovery. So, for example, talking to them about optimizing their BMI before a surgery, stopping smoking, stopping certain drug use, because all of those things impact the outcome. But they may not know that going in. And so really helping them understand that and having that education, is very, very important.
Yeah, no, it's kind of, as you're saying, creating and to some degree forcing that inflection point, because you've gathered and been able to assess data around it. Certainly kind of helps to tease something out that maybe someone would be reluctant to talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and kind of when those conversations or those discussions end up happening, I mean, I don't know if you have any data around it, but were there instances where either the patient or the clinician was more optimistic about what would happen or what the outcome would be?
I don't actually have data on that. I'm sure there are. I imagine every scenario has happened. But we certainly do know that setting expectations is directly correlated with patient experience. And so the adjustment in expectations, I think I don't fully understand, but have just encouraging patients and providers to have that conversation, whether it's in a digital environment or in person, is incredibly important for outcomes and even pain management. We've seen a correlation between expectations and pain post-surgery. If a patient knows that they're going to have pain day 2, it's almost not as bad for them because they're not anxious about it. So you don't increase that pain anxiety cycle. And they're like, yeah, my doctor told me, or the program told me that I was going to be in more pain today because the intraoperative pain medication ran out and I'm more active and it makes sense to me. So I'm okay with this level of pain. And by the way, I know that by the end of this week, my pain scale is going to come down because my doctor told me that. So it's really, thinking through all of those conversations and using the data that we have to inform the providers, and we build it into the platform, what conversations they should be having so that they can improve their patient satisfaction and those outcomes.
Yeah, no, I think that message of the power of communication and engagement is really important, and I think unfortunately going to have to be the great thought to leave people on, because believe it or not, we're already out of time. I want to thank my guest Bronwyn Spira for a great conversation today. Thanks, Matt. It was so much fun. Yeah, and thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.